If you enjoy our work, consider making a donation to mixtapestories.net or at Patreon/mixtapestories, all one word. Thank you.
The following episode is dedicated to all the torchbearers of democracy who brave the cold and the masked menaces who threaten us all.
Mixtape Stories. Creating beautiful fiction in a disappointing timeline.
It's 1993. Arsenio Hall is king. Gen X kids are bugging out to grunge and gangsta rap. And CERN releases the World Wide Web software of HTML to the world for free. And over in California, Octavia Butler publishes her newest novel, Parable of the Sower. Please note that this is a retrospective that's going to contain spoilers. Set in a dystopian future, it just so happens to take place in our present, the years 2024 through 2027 to be precise. The novel follows Lauren Olamina, a black teenager who has grown up with her family inside the confines of a walled cul-de-sac, alongside a small clutch of other families in the fictional town of Robledo, an exurb of Los Angeles. So, Butler's vision of America in the 2020s is not particularly hopeful. In fact, one could describe this world as a complete shit show. Of course, I have been known to refer to our particular hellscape of a reality as really disappointing, but at least your average American can generally still drive to a supermarket in their F-150s, pick up a bunch of Hot Pockets while wearing ill-fitting yoga pants and Crocs, and have every expectation to make it back home to doom scroll without being accosted. That's not the case for Lauren, her family, the rest of California, and America in general. In this version of the 2020s, Octavia Butler envisions the catastrophic effects of global warming have not only led to an extreme drought in California, it has severely hindered food production, and it seems to me that it was the effects of this climate change that has fundamentally broken the economy. But this is just me reading between the lines. She doesn't state it outright. Only the wealthy can afford gasoline. Electricity, while available inside the cul-de-sac, is unreliable. Food is so expensive that most in the cul-de-sac make use of gardens for subsistence agriculture. And clean water is almost as expensive as gas, and gas is out of reach for the majority of the people. So while the families inside the walled cul-de-sac will pay for clean running water, they've given up on owning vehicles. Which is a shame because the moment you leave the walled confines, it's freaking Road Warrior or Walking Dead out there. The outside is overrun by bandits, and worse, by hordes of addled druggies addicted to pyro, a drug that makes them obsessed with fire, looking at them, setting them, throwing people into them. Lauren has been outside of the walls on a number of occasions with her father and the others in the community for target practice, where her father, a professor and a Baptist minister, tries to teach her community to be self-reliant. Police do exist, but they are expensive, and they generally can't and won't arrive to stop a crime in progress. Lauren sees how vulnerable the community is. The walls will not be enough to protect them. Several other walled communities have been taken over by the hordes of pyros, and she sees it coming to their little slice of sanity. She's not a psychic or anything. Well, incidentally, she does have a particular skill, or curse as it is. Her biological mom was on a particular drug when she was pregnant with Lauren, and as a result, Lauren is hyper-empathetic, a sharer. She literally feels the physical sensations of others within eyesight of her. She shares their physical pleasure, and more commonly, feels their pain. Whenever she was beyond the walls, she experienced the physical suffering of the others on the outside. One time when a feral dog was shot, she felt its pain as well. Pain and suffering are ever present on the outside. It seems the only joy from the outside comes from this drug the pyros take, where watching fire is somehow better than sex. There is an election in 2024, and a guy named Donner wins. He's not an adult man-child or anything, but really, there is no one person or force to stop the downward spiral of this country. Lauren knows this. She also knows how vulnerable this community is, and that it won't survive. Nothing here does. Everything changes. Change, by the way, is a central theme. Laura tries to reconcile this insanity and chaos all around her through her journaling, which is how the story is told. We are given the dates, and each entry starts like a diary excerpt and moves seamlessly into live interaction with the world and the other characters around her. In her journaling, Lauren writes how her father, stepmother, and the other adults who grew up during America's heyday of the 20th century keep telling themselves that things will eventually get better. Maybe Donner will fix it, or something else. Her Baptist minister dad tries to reassure people, but Lauren doesn't buy into it at all. Actually, this is where we're introduced to Lauren's concept of God. God to her is change itself. She starts writing about this God as change, and comes to the idea of creating a new religion called Earthseed. More on that later. In the meantime, she's the daughter of a Baptist minister, and she plays the part for a while, but she's already preparing for what is inevitable. Change is a ruthless bitch, and this fragile little cul-de-sac is going to be on the shit end of the change stick, if there is such a thing. And when it comes, when the pyros break through the gates of the cul-de-sac, she already lost her father, and then she loses her stepmother, her younger brothers, her house, and everything she knew. She and two of her neighbors find each other, and they head northwards towards the Cascadian states of Oregon and Washington State, where water isn't at a premium and life is supposedly easier, though the border is heavily guarded. Lauren and crew meet a few people along the way, to include Bancoli, a man her father's age, and they make it to Bancoli's plot of land outside of Cape Mendocino near the Redwoods, and there they found the community called Acorn, which is both a nod to the nascent Earthseed religion as well as to the acorn flour she and her stepmother used to make bread to sustain the family back when they were in the cul-de-sac. Octavia Butler continued the story with a sequel, Parable of the Talents, published in 1998, where in the 2030s America begins to sound awfully like our America today. A Christian nationalist megalomaniac becomes president with the slogan, "I shit you not, make America great again." Considering that this was published in 1998, I think the Octavia Butler estate would have a good trademark infringement claim against the president. Anywho, Parable of the Sower was brutal, but I kind of knew this going in. I got into Octavia Butler some years back when I read one of her earliest novels, Kindred, and I was floored. The main character, Dana, a black woman from 1976, around the year it was published, is thrust back into the 1820s and 30s repeatedly without her consent whenever her third great-grandfather is experiencing something traumatic. Dana has to endure life as a black woman during the early 19th century, while her third great-grandfather, a white kid, seems to care more about what she can do for him than sympathizing with her plight. In Kindred, Butler didn't edit out the brutality of life, but I was pulled in and tethered to Dana because Butler is one of those authors who knows her characters, and we become invested in them. Butler succeeded again in pulling me into Parable of the Sower with Lauren Olamina. However, I think I came away from the novel unsatisfied. It was masterfully written, her characters were solid, and yet Well, I think there's a couple of things going on with my reaction. I'm going to start off with the world of Parable itself. Some describe the novel as dystopian, while others describe it as post-apocalyptic. I can understand the latter description would be used. I refer to it as dystopian in this world because it hasn't had a singular catastrophic event that ended civilization. Civilization itself still exists. There appears to be a federal, state, and local government apparatuses. What's more, you have TV broadcasts, you have moon bases, and the first explorers on Mars. Which goes to show you how badly we flub things, because even people in the 20th century, with the most grim projection of the future, figured we'd still at least return to the moon, right? And you also have elections where even the poorer people can and do vote for the president, like the people living in the cul-de-sac. So in that sense, we do have a civilization, decaying though it may be. And yet, everywhere where we go in Lauren's journey, there is no civilization to speak of. As far as Lauren's world is concerned, it's post-apocalyptic. Highway 101 and the I-5 are traveled primarily by pedestrian wanderers. The occasional 18-wheeler may come through, but otherwise, it's hordes of desperate people wandering on foot in both directions. Rapists, bandits, and pyros dominate this world. I would describe Lauren's world as kind of like Mad Max, the first movie, where there are cops still, but civilization is crumbling. But outside the walls, I have to say it's more Road Warrior and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Actually, the more I think about Parable of the Sower's world, its closest analog is Soylent Green. Production, supply, and transportation of food and other goods are severely stunted, and only the wealthy can afford consumer products. I wish Butler would have given us a passage where Lauren and her companions, Harry and Zahra, pass through a wealthy community. I don't know how they would be let in, and perhaps they would just be kicked out again, but I would love to see the contrast, to see the awe Lauren would have experienced had she walked through a wealthy neighborhood, see people driving cars and loading up on groceries full of meat and frozen dinners. I think the contrast would have given some firmament to this faltering society, where we would still see places like this did exist. Some of the people Lauren gathers along the way, like this guy Grayson and this woman Emery, were both servants and debt slaves to wealthy families. They escaped with their respective children and are now on the run. Debt slavery and escaping the corporate peonage is something Butler mentions early in the novel, but we get more about being a servant for the wealthy later in the novel with these two characters. Debt slavery is an intentional allegory to the slavery of the 18th and 19th centuries. Maybe we could have had Grayson or Emery tell us tales of life inside these communities. Or perhaps Bancoli himself, who was a doctor and once wealthy, could describe the opulence, which we would find to be mundane, while it would seem fanciful to Lauren and her neighbors. That all being said, Parable of the Sower is brutal. I know I said I knew this going in, but to be honest, I was hoping for a more hopeful ending for the first novel. Look, the reason why I picked it up was partly because it's Octavia Butler, partly because it's set in our current time, and partly because the reviews from the New York Times and others said things like, well, I'm paraphrasing, "This is a story of hope in a world in decline." I read it cover to cover, and I gotta say, I came away feeling far worse than I did coming into this novel. Now, I have to give some context here. I'm reading this novel in 2026, in a country that is decisively in a downward trajectory. Hope and optimism, both in fiction and in the news, is all but dead. So, coming across Octavia Butler, appreciating her past work, and the glowing reviews about hope, I was like, great, this is just what I need. But to be frank, it was a dirge of endless brutality without any real glimmer of hope. I know, The ending has Lauren leading the beginnings of the Earthseed community out in the wilderness. I get how I'm meant to read into this and believe that this is the beginning of a beautiful thing. However, the sequel will quickly kill any hope of that. Earthseed itself is a fascinating concept. One of the core precepts is as follows: all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. It's very Taoist. What I like even more is how, and I quote, the destiny of Earthseed is to take root among the stars. Too often people view space exploration as an extravagance. How many times have I heard someone say, we're wasting money on NASA when we could be spending it right here at home? I can only say that if you care for the long-term prosperity of humanity, it will require that we exploit the resources in our solar system instead of strip mining the Earth to its mantle, because we're either going to run out of resources sooner or later, or we're going to have to cull the population by like 7 billion. And no sane person wants that. I believe this is supported by Earthseed. Humanity is meant to spread Earthseed to the stars because otherwise humanity will perish. This is one of the reasons why I love Butler so much. She's a progressive who doesn't fall for other people's false assumptions. She comes to her own conclusions and she shares that with her characters. So, I love the Earthseed concept. The character Lauren writes over and over again about God is change, and it's all tied to Earthseed, and she's writing it as things are getting worse outside in the cul-de-sac. I'm thinking, yeah, of course, religions often arise during trying times. But this is where there's a disconnect between this God that Lauren states neither loves nor hates, nor even cares about you, and what people really need. Her version of God is not an entity so much as the second law of thermodynamics. This is where I come away feeling cold. Earthseed doesn't really offer anything to its followers outside of the fact that it says, shit happens, you better accept it and adjust to it or else you die. It may be the truth, but the truth is rarely very marketable. I think what's really happening is that Lauren is attempting to completely turn off all sensation of being human, which her being a sharer or a hyper-empath is understandable. She literally feels everyone's pain within eyesight of her. Near the end of the novel, Lauren repeats, God is change, and her lover, Bankole, seems to roll his eyes as he says, that doesn't mean anything. And then she insists that it means everything. I think Bankole is calling BS on Lauren here. Not the concept of Earthseed itself so much as the fact that she clings to this monistic concept bereft of any emotion, as though if she repeats the mantra enough, God is change, God is change, she will no longer be subjected to the trauma of living. And sadly, I think a lot of us can relate. Lauren's world is worse than ours, to be certain. Most Americans have jobs. We aren't going hungry. We have reliable electricity, well, so long as you don't live in Texas. And crime, despite the propaganda, has been at its lowest levels since the 1960s for the last decade or so. Economically speaking, prices are up, but we're not in like Soylent Green territory, not by a long shot. And yet, I can't help but suspect that our country is as broken as the America in parable. We all know we're living in some weird-ass dystopia that mimics normal on the outside. People drive to work, we pay bills, buy groceries, and stream entertainment like it's all normal. But we all know that this thing we're living in is not sustainable. Our country is on its way out. We're creeping towards the precipice, and there is nothing we can do about it individually to stop it. And we don't know what's going to happen next. Every morning when you unwisely choose to look up the latest news or post on your mobile devices, you are re-traumatized by yet another batshit crazy thing that the administration has done or something. Americans are being killed by masked agents on the street in plain view with witnesses recording it all. People, most of whom aren't criminals outside of not being here legally, are being pulled from their homes and schools and into some black box without any recourse. And we are forced to put on our own mask, as it were, and pretend that this is not happening, or that it's overblown, or not as bad as we truly know it to be. Recently, I was introduced to an essay, The Power of the Powerless, written back in 1979 by Czech dissident Václav Havel. In it, he described how communism survived by people living within the lie. His example was how a grocer put up a sign every morning saying, "Workers of the world unite." He didn't believe it. Neither did anyone else who all did the same thing and put up the same signs. But they did so out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of the need to just fucking get by. So many of us put up that proverbial sign every morning, not because the feds will kick in our doors, well, not yet, but because we cannot sustain living in a constant state of fucking outrage. We are witnessing the decline and the slow death of our nation. In our case, it is our civic religion of the rules-based order and democratic norms that have collapsed rather than the economy. But the result will eventually be the same, and we know this. We are all Lauren Olamina in her fragile cul-de-sac, knowing that the walls will soon no longer protect us, and that our little slice of sanity will be lost. And I can hear some of you saying, "Oh, you're being so melodramatic. You're an alarmist. In 5 years, you're going to cringe replaying this episode." Trust me, I want you to be right, and I pray to be wrong. I would love nothing more than to do a retrospective on this retrospective in a few years and say, "Well, I was a real Chicken Little, wasn't I?" But the truth is, if you think that things are going to return to normal, I have some bad news for you, sunshine. This is normal now. I don't know how long it will last, but there will be no returning to what was. Lauren knew this, hearing her parents and the other adults talking about how things will one day get back to the prosperity of the 20th century. We know that social media has broken the back of this nation, and we're all bracing for what's next. It's scary how Octavia Butler recognized that, as imperfect as things were in 1993, that the world would likely be even worse in our time. She was a baby boomer who came of age in the Los Angeles area during the turbulent 1960s. She had seen the Watts riots. Parable of the Sower was published a year after the Rodney King riots. The crack epidemic was hitting a fevered pitch while rival gangs were dominating the news. We see these elements going to its logical extreme in the novel. But as bad as things were in 1993, Butler knew she was actually living in the good old days, which is telling. There's this irrational part of me that resents those who wrote dystopian and apocalyptic fiction back in the late 20th century. For instance, Butler saw a world that would one day unravel, but for her, it was decades away. Not so for us. We are living in the beginning of the end. Well, the end of this era, anyway. Dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction was rather common subgenre starting from the early 1970s, but at least when Butler wrote Parable of the Sower, the market wasn't yet super saturated by dystopian and apocalyptic tales. I should point out that there are two kinds of dystopian and apocalyptic dramas. The vast majority today are pure disaster porn, the kind we've gotten inured to, while the second kind are far less common are the apocalyptic stories that are actually inspirational and hopeful. I call these feel-good apocalypses. I wanted Parable of the Sower to fit into the latter. However, it was grim, and I came away broken. Maybe had I read this novel back before our societal crack-up began, I could have taken some of the strands of Earthseed as a sign that this was actually a story of hope. But I can no longer see it now. This isn't to say that this wasn't a great novel, nor was its sequel, but I do believe that this hits too damn close to home psychologically. The constant barrage of outrages, the knowledge that it's only going to get worse. I believe that I read this novel in the wrong century. I mean, people in The Walking Dead generally don't care to read horror comics, you know? However, if you do want to know how to write a story in a journal style that feels like it's live action, I would highly recommend that you read this book. Butler is a master of bringing someone into your world through her characters. I just wish she lived to complete the series so I could get that hope, that ending that I needed. On that note, next month, I'm going to go over a post-apocalyptic novel called Dies the Fire that actually inspired me to write my first feel-good apocalyptic story, later titled Ride the Wilderness. Catch up with us next month on Mixtape Stories. Because at Mixtape Stories, we're creating beautiful fiction in a disappointing timeline.
Mixtape Stories hopes you enjoyed this podcast. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. You can find out more about us on our website, mixtapestories.net. If you would like to submit a short story to be produced on this podcast, click on the submissions link at mixtapestories.net for more information.